The calendar invites at 9 a.m. Promptly at 9, they sit down at the head of the table. They open a notebook. They unscrew a pen. They offer a brief, polite smile as the room settles. To anyone looking through the glass walls, this is a perfect picture of corporate health. The leader is present. The machinery is running. Then the project manager delivers the bad news. A major deadline is dead. The budget is blown. This is the moment that should trigger tension. It requires strategy. It demands a pivot. But the leader just nods. A slow, rhythmic, effortless nod. They don't flinch. They don't ask a single follow-up question. They just look up, smile faintly, and say, "Understood, let's keep moving." It looks like calm authority. It looks like deep trust in the team. But it feels like a vacuum. The eyes track the slides. The hands adjust the laptop. The professional mask is performing every routine of the role flawlessly. But the genuine presence, the sharp curiosity that used to light up the room has gone completely dark. The persona stayed. The person left. We sit in these rooms every day, watching the shell of a leader go through the motions. It forces us to look past the surface. Why does a system protect a ghost? And what is the true cost of a chair that is filled but completely empty?
Yeah, and the thing is, what you are looking at in that boardroom is definitely not an anomaly. And to be perfectly clear, it is absolutely not a display of, profound emotional control.
Right, because I think a lot of people might see that and think, oh, wow, they are just so stoic.
Exactly, but it's far from it. When you see that kind of vacant rhythmic nodding, you are actually witnessing a highly specific systemic behavioral response. In organizational psychology, this is classified as executive quiet quitting.
Executive quiet quitting. Okay, so how is that different from regular quiet quitting?
Well, it's a conscious, deliberate effort to perform the absolute bare minimum, right?
Right.
Just to maintain the optical illusion of leadership. It deviates entirely from the traditional forms of withdrawal we're used to seeing.
Yeah, because usually when we talk about withdrawal or quiet quitting, the conversation always centers on the front line.
Right, the entry-level staff.
Exactly. We think of an employee refusing to answer emails after 5 or taking a ton of sick days or just outright resigning. But this feels totally different.
This leader isn't, tendering a resignation. They aren't missing their meetings. I mean, they're physically right there in the room.
Suit is pressed, laptop is open.
Yeah. But psychologically, they have initiated this silent, comprehensive withdrawal from the actual cognitive demands of their role. They are present in body, but entirely absent in strategy.
So if they know the budget is blown and they know the deadline is dead, why wouldn't they react? What is mechanically happening in their brain that just tells them to nod and say, let's keep moving?
So to understand the mechanics of this ghosting, we have to look at the conservation of resources theory. It's often referred to as SHEAR.
SHEAR. Okay, what's the core premise of that?
Well, the foundational premise is that human beings are biologically and psychologically driven to obtain, retain, and protect valuable resources.
Wait, what kind of resources are we talking about here? Because we aren't talking about like food and water, right?
In a high-stakes workplace context, those vital resources are things like cognitive bandwidth, emotional resilience, status, and just sheer mental energy.
Energy is finite.
Exactly. And when an executive is subjected to continuous, unmitigated workplace stressors, their internal reservoirs of these resources are just relentlessly drained. And this is where the massive misconception usually happens.
What do people usually get wrong about it?
People look at a completely disengaged executive and assume it's just an attitudinal failure. They think, oh, this person just doesn't care anymore, or they've lost their moral fiber.
Right, like they're just being lazy.
But through the lens of COR theory, quiet quitting at the leadership level isn't laziness. It's a highly rational, fundamentally defensive strategy.
Okay, let me stop you there and play devil's advocate for a second. We are talking about executives here.
Sure.
People who are often compensated exceptionally well, sometimes in the millions, specifically to handle extreme stress. Isn't grueling pressure just the price of admission for that level of leadership? Why should anyone viewing this deep dive see this as a defensive strategy rather than just a total failure to do the job they're paid for?
Because that is the exact trap that corporate boards fall into. Compensation does not magically alter human biology. The brain does not have an infinite capacity to process complex trauma just because your direct deposit is larger.
Okay, so the brain just doesn't care.
Exactly. The mind recognizes a state of chronic depletion regardless of the tax bracket. When those resources, that emotional resilience, that bandwidth drop dangerously low, the brain automatically triggers a withdrawal mechanism.
To prevent what? A total breakdown.
Yes, to prevent total psychological bankruptcy. It is a self-preservation instinct. The executive stops caring because caring requires an expenditure of energy that they simply no longer possess.
It's like a biological failsafe. So if we dig a little deeper into what actually causes that depletion, how do we identify the specific drains?
We use what is called the Job Demands Resources model, the GDR model. This framework allows us to isolate the specific, compounding chronic stressors that are draining these leaders.
Because it's never just working hard, right?
Humans can work incredibly hard for long periods if the conditions are right. The withdrawal happens due to a toxic combination of severe pressures.
Okay, what does that combination actually look like in practice? Break down the JDR model for us.
First, you have abusive supervision.
Abusive supervision. At the executive level, who on earth is abusing a CEO or a VP?
Oh, it happens constantly from the very top. CEOs and senior executives face immense, sometimes incredibly hostile pressure from boards of directors, activist shareholders, or massive private equity sponsors.
So the abuse flows down from the very top of the financial food chain.
They're subjected to relentless demands for short-term yield, public berating in closed-door sessions, and constantly shifting goalposts.
So the pressure from above is brutal. What else is in the JDR model?
Second, you have work role overload. This is where the sheer volume and, more importantly, the complexity of the demands completely exceed human cognitive capacity.
Give me an example of that complexity.
Imagine context switching from a severe supply chain failure at 9:00 a.m. to a massive PR crisis at 9:45 a.m. to a structural layoff strategy at 9:30 a.m. The brain never gets to finish processing one crisis before the next one hits. And then you add the third stressor, job insecurity.
But executives have contracts, right? How insecure is it really?
The average tenure of a CEO is shrinking rapidly. It recently dropped from over 8 years to just under 7, and in some sectors it's even shorter. The threat of sudden unceremonious replacement is constant.
So you're operating in this state of perpetual jeopardy. You have too much to do. The people above you are demanding impossible returns, and you could be fired on a Tuesday morning with no warning.
And that brings us to the fourth and perhaps most crucial stressor, low relational job design.
Low relational job design.
It means the work becomes fundamentally detached from human meaning. When an executive's entire existence is abstracted into tracking, fractional shifts in share prices or EBITDA margin.
And work just completely lacks any social impact.
Exactly. It lacks meaningful human connection. The leader becomes profoundly isolated at the apex of the organization. They aren't building a team. They are just managing a spreadsheet of human capital.
But those four stressors, the abusive supervision, the overload, the insecurity, and the low relational design, they don't just instantly result in that vacant stare in the boardroom. There has to be a breaking point, right?
There is. The central psychological transmission mechanism between those stressors and the silent withdrawal is burnout.
Okay, so burnout is the bridge.
Burnout is the mediator. The toxic environment doesn't instantly cause the executive to check out. The environment causes profound emotional exhaustion and cognitive fatigue. That is the burnout.
And then the burnout triggers the behavior.
The burnout dictates the behavioral withdrawal. The environment drains the resources, the burnout sets in, and the quiet quitting is the final visible symptom of a system that has just crashed.
It makes me think of a smartphone that has automatically engaged low power mode. Yeah, like if you've ever been traveling and your phone battery drops to 1 or 2%, the screen is still technically on, right? The basic interface functions.
You can still make a call.
Right, if you press the home button, it responds. It looks like a functioning phone. But beneath the glass, the operating system has forcibly shut down all the background processing.
The location services, the push notification.
Everything that requires deep processing power is just shut off to keep the device from going black entirely.
That is a remarkably accurate mechanical analogy. The executive in that boardroom is in low power mode. They are preserving just enough physiological and psychological battery to nod, smile faintly, and say, let's keep moving.
Because if they actually engaged with the blown budget...
If they were to ask questions, demand a pivot, strategize a recovery that would require high-level cognitive processing power, that their internal operating system is already shut off.
Just to prevent a total breakdown. But here is the terrifying part of that analogy for an organization. If my personal smartphone goes into low power mode, I might miss a text message. It's a localized problem. But when a senior executive engages the survival mechanism, the blast radius has to be massive.
The blast radius is catastrophic. That mechanical shift is precisely what makes this phenomenon so dangerous, specifically at the leadership level.
Because they steer the ship.
Unlike a frontline worker, when an executive enters this state of silent withdrawal, the entire organizational structure loses its compass. Remember, disengagement at this level is shaped by deep subconscious cognitive evaluations of effort-reward imbalances.
So their brain is literally doing the math on whether it's worth it to care.
Exactly. The leader's brain calculates that the emotional and cognitive cost of intervening, of fighting the battle to fix a broken project, far outweighs any potential reward or safety they might gain.
And so the entire system is just left rudderless. Let's put a face to what that actually looks like for the people doing the work on the ground. So picture a cross-functional manager. She is standing outside the glass-walled office of her program director, a guy named Vance.
Okay, setting the scene.
And in Elena's hands is a red-flagged engineering report. Imagine the physical weight of that document. It's the kind of report that proves the central architecture of their new software rollout is fundamentally flawed.
It's the kind of data that should trigger an immediate emergency halt to the whole operation.
The stakes are absolute. And through the glass, Elena looks at Director Vance. He looks like a statue of executive competence. His suit is immaculate, his jaw is set, his eyes are scanning a complex spreadsheet.
He's surrounded by all the visual markers of authority.
Now, for 3 months, Elena's cross-functional team has been drowning. Deadlines are slipping, team morale is in the dirt, and every single critical decision they try to send up the chain to Vance just disappears into a bureaucratic black hole.
Which is agonizing for a team.
So Elena knocks and enters the office. She says, Vance, the propulsion matrix is failing our stress tests. If we don't delay the rollout, the whole architecture collapses. Her voice is tight with panic.
This is the moment that requires a leader to step out of the spreadsheet and confront reality.
This is the moment for alarm. But Vance doesn't flinch. He doesn't get angry at the failure. He doesn't even ask to see the data.
He just gives that blank stare.
He simply offers a calm, entirely detached blink. He looks at her and says, his voice completely hollow, let us socialize this with the steering committee next month, Elena. We need broader alignment.
Oh, next month.
Next month. By next month, the project will have launched and it will be past the point of no return. And looking into Vance's vacant, unbothered eyes, Elena experiences this cold, terrifying realization.
That he just doesn't care.
Vance hasn't lost his mind. He doesn't misunderstand the engineering report. He has just checked out. He is physically present to collect his stock options, but emotionally, he has completely abandoned the ship to avoid the crossfire of competing corporate factions.
So she's just left holding the bag.
Elena walks back to her team's bullpen. She sees the eager, anxious faces of her engineers waiting for a directive, and she feels a profound despair. Her leader hasn't formally quit. He has just left them behind to take the blame for a slow-motion wreck.
That scenario with Vance perfectly illustrates the 3 primary modes of executive withdrawal. It is textbook.
Break those down for us. What exactly is Vance doing there mechanically?
First, we see extreme avoidance. He is deliberately delaying a tough, highly critical decision by hiding behind the bureaucracy of the organization.
By saying, let's socialize this next month.
That is a linguistic shield. It sounds like corporate prudence, but it is actually a mechanism to avoid the immediate conflict of halting a project.
It sounds professional, but it accomplishes absolutely nothing. What's the second mode?
The second is delegation without direction. By doing nothing, he is functionally pushing all the accountability downward. He is forcing Elena and her engineering team to bear the immense psychological stress of the failing architecture.
Because they know it's going to fail and they have to live with that anxiety.
Right, but Vance is providing none of the strategic guidance, cover, or authority necessary to actually solve the problem. He is delegating the panic, but keeping the authority locked away.
Which leaves the team completely paralyzed.
The third is external retreat. By deferring the conversation and seeking broader alignment, Vance is reducing his own visibility.
He's making sure his fingerprints aren't on the murder weapon.
He is ensuring that when the project does collapse, his fingerprints aren't on any recent decisive actions. He is retreating from the critical forums where leadership is actually required.
Now, if we look at management theories, people might try to put a positive spin on this. They might say Vance is empowering his team by not interfering.
It is vital to understand what this behavior is not. This is not democratic leadership where a leader actively shares decision-making power with the team. And it is certainly not servant leadership, which focuses on removing roadblocks for the growth of the team. What Vance is demonstrating is laissez-faire leadership. It is passive avoidant leadership, masquerading as delegation.
Passive avoidant, meaning he is actively choosing to avoid reality.
The leader fundamentally refuses to confront reality. And the downstream effects of this are just catastrophic for the organization.
What happens to the team in that environment?
You see massive spikes in team turnover, plummeted morale, and the rapid cultivation of a culture of blame. Nature abhors a vacuum. When decisive leadership is absent, paranoia and self-preservation fill the void.
Everyone on Elena's team is going to start pointing fingers at each other because they know Vance isn't going to protect them. But the paradox here is maddening. To an untrained observer, maybe to Vance's boss or the board, Vance's total lack of reaction actually looks like extreme grace under pressure.
It looks like he's totally in control.
Right. He didn't yell at Elena. He didn't panic. It looks like a calm, collected executive trusting his process. But it's a false calm. It's exactly like a pilot taking their hands off the yoke while flying an airliner directly into a Category 5 hurricane. And turning around to the terrified passengers in the cabin and telling them in a perfectly soothing voice that they are simply trusting the aerodynamics of the plane.
Oh.
It looks like absolute confidence, but it is actually a complete abdication of duty disguised as composure.
That pilot analogy hits the nail on the head. And this brings us to a massive critical misunderstanding in corporate culture regarding how to fix this disengagement.
Okay, so how do companies usually try to fix a situation like Vance and Elena's?
Organizations look at a disconnected matrix like that and almost universally conclude that the problem is a lack of communication. HR or organizational design consultants will come in and mandate policies to increase what is called workplace social interaction intensity.
More meetings.
They schedule more touch points. They mandate daily stand-ups. They create new cross-functional alignment meetings. They force Vance and Elena to sit in a room together more often.
But does that actually work?
The empirical data shows us that high interaction frequency does absolutely nothing to compensate for structural managerial inadequacies.
So forcing a burnt-out boss to attend more meetings doesn't make them lead better.
In fact, it often makes it worse. If the core issue is an executive in silent withdrawal, increasing the frequency of interactions without addressing the underlying burnout only normalizes the quiet quitting.
It puts the ghost on display.
The team sits in these new daily stand-ups, they watch Vance continue to abdicate responsibility, and they learn to mirror his apathy. Interaction without authentic leadership is nothing more than shared suffering. It drains the team faster.
Okay, but if Vance knows the ship is sinking, and he knows that eventually the failure of this project is going to reflect poorly on his department, why on earth is his brain telling him to just sit there and build this impenetrable armor? What are the internal defense mechanisms that cause a smart person to act so irrationally?
To understand why leaders build this armor, we have to examine the illusions of control and the cognitive traps they fall into. There are 3 primary psychological barriers to vulnerability that executives construct.
What is the first barrier?
The first barrier is avoiding joy.
Wait, avoiding joy? If an executive is exhausted and burnt out, why would they subconsciously avoid the one thing that might make them feel better?
It seems highly counterintuitive, but you have to look at it through the lens of chronic stress. For a leader who feels constantly under siege, experiencing joy or satisfaction requires letting go of control.
It requires lowering their psychological shield.
They are driven by a relentless, deeply ingrained belief that they must always be braced for the next disaster. If you are constantly bracing for impact, leaning into a moment of joy feels incredibly dangerous.
Because the contrast of a sudden crisis hitting while your guard is down would be too painful.
So they flatline their emotions. They refuse to celebrate wins. They refuse to connect deeply with positive momentum because staying numb feels safer.
It's like walking through a haunted house. You don't let yourself relax and laugh because you know something is going to jump out at you. You just stay tense the whole time. What is the second barrier?
The second barrier is perfectionism.
But isn't perfectionism a good thing in leadership? Don't we want executives to strive for excellence?
Striving for excellence is very healthy. But perfectionism, in this clinical context, is not about excellence. It is the illusion of flawlessness, used purely as a defensive shield to prevent criticism.
Oh, so it's a way to hide.
Yes.
Yeah.
The burnt-out leader believes that if they can just do everything perfectly, they will be immune to the abusive supervision or the job insecurity we discussed earlier. But it's an impossible standard.
And what does that impossible standard actually produce?
What it actually breeds is a constant, paralyzing self-criticism. And when a leader is terrified of making a mistake, taking bold, necessary risks becomes impossible. They freeze.
Which perfectly explains Vance delaying the decision on the propulsion matrix. He can't make a perfect choice, so he makes no choice at all.
The third barrier consists of numbing behaviors. When the sheer discomfort, the anxiety, and the cognitive load of the role become intolerable, leaders look for an escape hatch.
What does that escape hatch look like?
This can manifest as severe emotional detachment, the vacant stare in the boardroom, or, conversely, it can manifest by overworking.
Wait, overworking is a numbing behavior.
They will dive into menial operational spreadsheets for 14 hours a day so that they are physically and mentally too exhausted to actually feel the anxiety of the massive strategic problems they are ignoring.
They numb out by doing busy work.
And this entire psychological state is deeply tied to a phenomenon clinically known as cognitive fusion.
Cognitive fusion. Okay, what exactly is fusing together?
Cognitive fusion is the psychological state where an individual takes their internal thoughts, their private verbal events, as literal, absolute truths about the real world.
Give me an example of how that plays out in a leader's head.
Suppose an executive who is already depleted and stressed is facing a major crisis. A thought pops into their head, this problem is unsolvable. Or, if I make a decision to halt this project, I will be destroyed by the board.
Okay, so a dark, anxious thought.
Right. Now, a healthy mind can recognize that as just a thought, a passing anxiety born of stress. But under cognitive fusion, the leader does not view those words as just a passing anxiety.
How did they view it?
They view the problem entirely through the lens of it being fundamentally unfixable. The internal thought and the external reality become welded or fused together.
So if they think, I'm going to fail, their brain treats it as an objective fact, like gravity exists.
And this permanently blinds them to alternative solutions. They are no longer looking at the organizational crisis itself. They are trapped inside their own verbal evaluations of the crisis.
It operates exactly like a Chinese finger cuffs trap.
Way to describe it.
You know those little woven bamboo tubes you play with as a kid? You stick your index fingers in both ends. As soon as the executive gets ensnared by their anxiety, their immediate primal instinct is to pull away from that discomfort.
Right. They try to rip their fingers out.
They use avoidance, they numb out, they distance themselves emotionally. But just like the woven bamboo, the harder they try to pull away and escape the internal discomfort, the tighter the trap becomes.
The tension just increases.
The avoidance strategy actually amplifies the burnout and the anxiety. The only way to loosen the weave, the only way to actually escape the trap, is to do the entirely counterintuitive thing. You have to stop pulling.
You have to push in.
You have to lean in, push your fingers together, and make contact with the discomfort to loosen the hold.
That mechanism of leaning into the discomfort is central to overcoming this. In advanced psychological coaching, we often expand on that idea using the quicksand metaphor.
Okay, how does the quicksand metaphor work?
When a traveler accidentally falls into a pit of quicksand, their immediate panicked instinct is to struggle. They try to lift their legs, to fight their way out, to violently escape the terrifying reality of sinking.
Which is human nature. If you're sinking, you fight.
But the physics of quicksand dictate that struggling and lifting a leg actually decreases your surface area. All your weight is concentrated on a smaller point, which increases downward pressure. The harder you fight to escape, the faster you sink.
So how do you survive quicksand?
Survival requires overriding that massive primal instinct. It requires you to maximize your surface area. You have to sprawl out, lay back on the surface of the sand, and come into full, total contact with the terrifying situation.
You have to literally embrace the thing that is killing you.
Psychologically, yes. By accepting the natural private events, the internal emotions like severe anxiety, doubt, or the paralyzing fear of failure without defensive struggle, the leaders stop sinking.
They stop wasting their finite resources fighting themselves.
They stop wasting their incredibly finite cognitive resources on fighting their own feelings. This acceptance is what loosens the Chinese finger cuffs. It frees up their cognitive bandwidth, allowing them to finally redirect their focus to solving the actual organizational crisis.
But getting an executive who has spent a decade building a suit of armor to suddenly sprawl out in the quicksand cannot be easy. How do you actually facilitate that process of resurrection?
It requires a very specific clinical framework. You cannot just tell them to cheer up or to communicate more.
Let's look at a case study of how this intervention actually works. Imagine a guy named Marcus.
Okay, Marcus.
Marcus is a CEO. He has 30 years of experience navigating the brutal, cutthroat logistics industry. Picture him sitting in the completely silent, sterile environment of a corporate coaching suite.
A very intimidating space for someone who's burnt out.
He is sitting in a heavy leather chair, staring intensely at a piece of abstract modern art on the wall, doing absolutely everything in his power to avoid eye contact with Sarah, his executive coach.
He's fully armored up.
Marcus is the classic ghost at the wheel. And the physical manifestation of his burnout is impossible to hide at this point. His hands, resting on his knees, are trembling slightly.
The physical toll of suppressing that much reality is just immense.
For 2 years, Marcus's personal values, his belief in mentorship, his integrity, his desire to build sustainable growth have been systematically ground into dust by a board culture that demanded quarterly profit at absolutely any cost.
The JDR pressure cooker.
To survive that, Marcus utilized a brutal survival tactic. He took his soul, put it in a drawer, and locked it. He became a machine. So Sarah, the coach, looks at him and asks a very quiet question.
What does she ask?
She asks, when was the last time you spoke a sentence in this building that you actually believed?
Oh, that is a devastating question for a fused leader.
The silence stretches out, it's heavy and raw. Marcus tries his best to summon his executive armor. He tries to deflect. He starts talking about market volatility, shareholder value, logistical headwinds, all the corporate buzzwords.
Trying to hide behind the jargon.
But the sheer weight of his exhaustion finally crushes the words. He stops talking, looks at the floor and whispers, "I don't remember." It is a visceral confession. The mask of the invulnerable, perfectly composed executive shatters entirely, revealing a man who is literally suffocating under his own compliance. Once a leader like Marcus is exposed like that, what is the actual framework to rebuild them?
To pull a leader like Marcus back from that state of profound silent withdrawal, organizational psychology utilizes a framework called acceptance and commitment training, or AC training.
AC training. Okay, how is that different from traditional leadership coaching?
Traditional coaching often focuses on problem solving or skill building. AC training is not about teaching a leader to employ toxic positivity or to just think happier thoughts. It is a rigorous clinical framework designed to build psychological flexibility.
Psychological flexibility, how does it do that?
It operates across several key domains. The first domain is diffusion. This directly combats the cognitive fusion we discussed earlier, the welding of thoughts to reality. We have to prove to the executive's brain that thoughts are not threats.
How do you prove that?
A very common, effective exercise used in this stage is the lemon exercise.
How does the lemon exercise work?
The coach sits across from the executive and asks them to vividly imagine a lemon. They ask them to picture cutting it in half, to imagine the smell of the citrus, to picture biting into the sour flesh.
Oh, I can literally feel my mouth watering just hearing that.
Naturally, this vivid imagery elicits a physical response. The executive's mouth will actually begin to salivate. The brain responds to the thought as if it were physical reality.
Okay, so the mind creates a physical reaction to an imaginary stimulus.
Then the coach instructs the leader to repeat the word lemon rapidly, out loud, for 25 seconds straight.
Lemon, lemon.
Lemon. Very quickly, the word dissolves into phonetic mush.
This just becomes a weird sound.
It loses all meaning. It strips the word of its evocative power. The salivation stops. This exercise powerfully proves to the executive that language and thoughts are fundamentally just arbitrary sounds and internal stimuli.
So if they have a toxic thought,
if a thought like, "I am a complete failure," or "this situation is impossible," enters their mind, it does not have to dictate their behavior. It is just a word. It is a lemon. It is a sound their brain is making up. They can observe the thought without being controlled by it.
Once they realize they aren't controlled by their thoughts, what's next?
The second domain is contacting the present moment. A leader in profound withdrawal is almost always oscillating between being obsessed with past failures and being completely paralyzed by future catastrophes.
They are everywhere but in the room.
They must be trained to act in the now.
But how do you train someone to stay in the present when their job is literally to forecast the future of the company?
You teach them to treat distracting, anxious thoughts like leaves floating down a stream. When a thought about a board meeting next month pops up and causes panic, the leader acknowledges it. There is a thought about the board meeting, places it on a leaf, and watches it float by.
They don't dive into the water to chase it.
They do not dive into the water to chase the leaf. They stay on the bank in the present moment, focusing on the immediate decision required today.
Which preserves their cognitive bandwidth.
And that leads to the third, and perhaps most profound domain, self as context. This is often illustrated by the chessboard metaphor.
The chessboard metaphor.
High-achieving executives often view their own minds as a brutal battleground. They believe they are the good chess pieces, their confidence, their competence, their strategic brilliance, and they believe they're constantly at war with the bad pieces.
The anxiety, the doubt, the imposter syndrome.
They spend vast amounts of energy trying to win this internal war, trying to kill off the bad pieces so only the good pieces remain.
Which is exhausting and ultimately impossible, right? You can't kill your own anxiety permanently.
AC training shifts this paradigm entirely. The leader is taught that they are not the pieces at all. They are not the good thoughts, and they are not the bad thoughts. The leader is the board itself.
Wait, the board itself?
They are the conscious space, the context, that holds all the pieces. The board doesn't take sides. The board isn't damaged when the black pieces or the white pieces move. The board simply accepts the presence of all the pieces.
That is a massive paradigm shift. You just stop fighting yourself.
And once that internal struggle stops, the leader has the energy to move to the final domain values and committed action. They can finally realign with their core values. They establish process goals, how they want to lead moment to moment with integrity, rather than fixating purely on outcome goals, which they often cannot control anyway.
Okay, I understand the clinical framework. It sounds powerful in a controlled room with a coach. But when we translate this back into the corporate environment, it usually gets bundled into the popular buzzword of vulnerability. HR departments love telling leaders to be vulnerable, but telling an embattled, exhausted executive like Marcus to just be vulnerable in front of a cutthroat board of directors sounds exactly like telling a soldier to take off their Kevlar vest in the middle of a live firefight.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It sounds noble in a TED Talk, but in practice, in a ruthless corporate matrix, it seems like a rapid path to professional suicide. How is this AC training actually practical if the environment remains hostile?
You have just highlighted the most critical point of failure in modern leadership development. Vulnerability as a standalone, naked directive is incredibly dangerous.
It's weaponized.
Vulnerability only works, and AC training can only actually take root if it is paired with a true structural culture of safety within the organization. If the environment remains toxic, if the abusive supervision continues, demanding vulnerability is nothing more than demanding exposure to further abuse. It is organizational malpractice.
So what does a real culture of safety actually look like? Not just Pizza Fridays, but structural safety.
A true culture of safety requires 3 foundational structural pillars. First, you must establish a just culture. This is an environment where a clear, defined structural line is drawn between honest human error and reckless behavior.
So you aren't punishing honest mistakes.
Mistakes are treated as systemic flaws to be investigated, not as immediate opportunities for punishment or scapegoating.
If a project fails, the question is what broke in our process, not whose head is going to roll.
The second pillar is a reporting culture. Employees and leaders at all levels must realize that errors are inevitable in complex systems. They must feel completely structurally protected when speaking up about near misses, failing projects, or burnout without any fear of retaliation.
If Elena brings that red flag engineering report, she needs to know she will be rewarded for catching it, not punished for delivering bad news.
And the third pillar.
Let me guess, learning from it.
The third is a learning culture. The organization must actively collect data from both its massive failures and its massive successes, openly analyzing and sharing that information to apply the best evidence to future work processes. It cannot be secretive.
So if an organization demands vulnerability from its leaders, but fails to build a just reporting and learning culture to catch them,
it is simply setting those leaders up to be martyrs. Therefore, the responsibility is not just on the individual executive to heal in a vacuum. It is on the organization to build a system that detects and prevents the ghosting before it ever requires a resurrection.
Let's pivot to that systemic detection. How do organizations catch this phenomenon before the ghost completely takes over the boardroom? Because typically the standard corporate reflex is just to monitor financial key performance indicators. They just look at the spreadsheets.
Relying on financial KPIs as a primary detection mechanism for executive withdrawal is fatal.
Why? If the leader is checking out, shouldn't the numbers drop immediately?
Because of momentum. Large organizations have massive operational momentum. the metrics, the revenue, the profit margins, the market share, only drop long after the leader has psychologically withdrawn.
So the financials are a lagging indicator.
By the time you see the profit margin dip, the culture has already collapsed, months, maybe years prior. To detect executive quiet quitting early, organizations must implement early warning sensing systems that monitor the behavioral and psychological health of the leadership matrix, not just the financial output.
It is exactly like seismology. You cannot wait for the massive earthquake to hit the surface and shatter the city to realize you have a tectonic problem.
No, by then it's way too late.
By the time the buildings are falling, by the time the revenue tanks are tanks, the devastation is absolute. You have to place sensors deep underground to monitor the microtremors. In a corporate environment, those microtremors are the subtle behavioral shifts.
That is exactly how we need to view organizational health.
It's the delayed budget approvals that used to take Vance a single day and now take 3 weeks. It's the slight, unannounced retreat from speaking at industry forums. It's the sudden, eerie lack of genuine debate in board meetings. You have to measure the pressure building along the fault line before it actually snaps.
And the instruments used to measure those microtremors must be structural and objective.
What are those instruments?
First, organizations need to redesign their feedback loops. They need targeted 360-degree reviews that focus explicitly on executive energy, presence, and decisiveness, rather than just their operational output.
So you aren't asking, did they hit their targets? You're asking, are they present?
Yes. Are they actively engaged in rigorous debate, or are they just nodding, smiling faintly, and moving on? Second, organizations must conduct rigorous talent pipeline health checks.
Meaning, looking at the people directly underneath the executive.
This is the ultimate canary in the coal mine. When ambitious, high-performing mid-level talent begins disengaging, missing deadlines, or leaving the firm unexpectedly, it is rarely an isolated issue with the mid-level management itself.
It's reflecting the top.
It is almost always a direct, mirrored reflection of the tone, or the complete lack thereof, at the top. The apathy flows downward. The ghosting is contagious.
If the director doesn't care, the manager stopped caring. What's the third sensor?
Third, organizations must track leading indicators regarding time, specifically CEO and executive time allocation.
Literally tracking their calendars.
Tracking where they are directing their cognitive energy, where are they spending their hours? Are they retreating into operational minutia, spending hours formatting spreadsheets or tweaking slide decks to actively avoid strategic confrontation?
You look for the numbing behavior.
Furthermore, what is the quality and the friction level of the debate at the board level? If there is no friction, there is no engagement.
Okay, let's say the seismometers go off. The sensors detect that a senior executive is entering low power mode. The microtremors are there. What are the strategic solutions? Because we already established you can't just mandate more meetings.
Once detected, the strategic solutions must go far beyond a simple HR intervention or a coaching session. The organization must be willing to rewire its internal architecture. The very first step is that they must entirely rethink incentives.
Rethinking how they are paid and promoted.
If a system rewards leaders purely for maintaining operational stability and hitting rigid quarterly targets, it inherently punishes risk, innovation, and vulnerability. If Vance knows he gets his bonus as long as the boat doesn't rock, he will never point out a leak.
So you have to change what is rewarded.
Organizations must stop rewarding mere operational maintenance. They must begin explicitly rewarding bold decision-making, calculated risks, and the willingness to pivot, even if that pivot causes short-term friction or misses a quarterly target.
You have to incentivize the courage to break things that need breaking.
Exactly. Furthermore, they must implement a modernized version of reverse mentoring.
Usually reverse mentoring just means pairing a senior executive with a 24-year-old junior employee so the executive can learn about new tech trends or social media.
Right, which is highly superficial. True reverse mentoring in this context serves a much deeper psychological purpose. It provides the isolated, fused executive with unfiltered, ground-level insights into how their behavior, their withdrawal, their passive avoidance silence is actually being perceived and felt by the organization.
So it grounds them again.
It reconnects them to the human impact of their leadership. It breaks the low relational job design stressor.
It forces them out of the boardroom and into the bullpen.
Finally, there must be a structural implementation of closed-loop communication and prioritization.
What does closed-loop communication actually solve here?
It directly combats the work role overload. Organizations must use rigid structural tools to reduce the massive cognitive stacking that leads to the burnout in the first place.
What does that look like practically?
When communication loops are closed, meaning when tasks are clearly assigned, confirmed, and verified without ambiguity, and when strategic priorities are violently pared down to the absolute essentials, it dramatically reduces the massive cognitive drain of uncertainty.
Ambiguity is exhausting.
Yes, ambiguity is exhausting. Clarity preserves battery life. When you eliminate the ambiguity, you prevent the executive from being pushed into low-power mode.
Resolving this crisis of the empty chair, then, requires a massive fundamental shift in the entire organizational mindset. It sounds like companies have to move completely away from the replace and restart paradigm.
The ejector seat mentality.
Right. The assumption that a broken, burnt-out leader should simply be fired, ejected, and replaced with a fresh, energetic one, only to subject that new leader to the exact same crushing JDR pressures until they break too.
That cycle is endless and extraordinarily expensive. Organizations must begin viewing executive engagement not as a static, innate personality trait that someone either has or doesn't have. They must view deep engagement as a continuous, strategic capability that must be actively managed, fiercely protected, and structurally supported by the entire enterprise.
We have thoroughly dissected the mechanical shift of the executive ghost today. We have traced the psychological progression from an empty shell, a leader retreating behind the impenetrable armor of numbing, avoidance, and cognitive fusion simply to survive a crushing, overloaded environment. We mapped the clinical journey out of the quicksand, utilizing the psychological flexibility of AC training to strip the power from paralyzing thoughts, stepping back to become the chessboard rather than fighting as the pieces, and realigning with authentic values. And we have seen clearly that resurrecting the leader is entirely impossible without an organization committed to building a true culture of safety, one that actively monitors the micro-tremors of disengagement and structuralizes engagement as a core protected capability.
The ultimate cost of a silently withdrawn leader is never just measured in a single blown budget, a delayed engineering rollout, or a missed quarterly target. It is measured in the silent, systematic extinction of an organization's collective courage. When the person at the apex of power successfully normalizes surrender as a daily strategy, the entire enterprise learns that the only way to survive is to become invisible.